Module 6, folks. We're getting there. I'd like to start with a people question I thought of while reading the Matthews article. And I hope it makes sense, since it's largely about the relationship between folklorist and documentary John Cohen and his mentor and documentary subject, Roscoe Holcomb. So I'm going to take a step back and ask, what was Matthews' relationship with Cohen like? Was it exploitative, potentially in the same ways that Cohen's relationship in some ways was in part an exploitation of Roscoe Holcomb? How do we in our work take advantage of the people that we're studying and recording? The focus on personal interactions here makes sense. Matthews explains folk music's shift in emphasis from what Cohen characterized as social reform or worldwide reform to a movement focused on a search for real and human values. That shift happens as there was a shift in documentary photography during the mid-20th century, and a change from producing photographs that exposed injustice and championed social reform to a perspective more explicitly focused on subjective experience. So there is this similar change in music around the same time, I think. Folk music moved from protest around through the 30s, 50s, 60s, into more of what I call an authenticity quest, looking for realness, either in folk revival, looking for old and weird things, or in creation of new things that were authentic in a singer-songwriter kind of way. There's a shift from outward to inward focused projects in this period when Cohen and Holcomb are doing what they're doing. So again, let's think about Matthews as an author. Matthews, he raises some interesting questions. Being critical, he's proposing that Cohen was not only an exploiter, though. He says he was not just an outsider, he was an insider through musical experience. And I think this makes some sense, especially in light of Jeff Titan's ideas from last week. Anyhow, Matthews states that, quote, Cohen was often criticized. Well, I would argue that in his later years of collecting and recording, Cohen wasn't really an outsider. Though he was not from Appalachia, he was a musician himself with a strong interest in music of the region, and he did become surrounded and immersed by the culture. For example, he performed alongside Roscoe Holcomb at the Berkeley Folk Festival in California. He was a part of the music and not just an outsider. And I think that's an interesting thing, that he wasn't just an outsider. He was also doing things that made him an insider. Still, while part of the music, he was, I think, idealizing the music. Cohen, I think, kept people like Roscoe Holcomb crystallized in the past as these old-fashioned figures. And this is a perception that doesn't allow us to consider them. And I think if we do that kind of thing in our own work, it doesn't allow us to see our research consultants, the people we record and document, as active and changeable, as real and modern people. Of course, as Matthews explains, it seems Cohen went into his study with intentions of forming bonds, probably to help improve his own musical craft, his abilities to make music. And that's something that seems unavoidable for someone who looks up to their subjects, and especially like a musical guru, someone like Roscoe Holcomb. It would appear that the field worker coming in from the outside may well have an integral role in the preservation of folk tradition. How might this be a problem? Well, Chalamet discusses this issue in her article in Shadows in the Field, and co-editor Tim Cooley has had his own situation. He was asked to judge a music and dance contest in the Polish Tatra Mountains right after starting his fieldwork there. He was by no means an expert, but somehow he became involved as a tastemaker, as a decision maker in the music. Well, back to Matthews and Holcomb. What do we do with situations where there's power involved? And we as an outsider, like Holcomb and like Tim Cooley, we get involved with culture. Is there anger in the situation of Cohen because people in North Carolina and Kentucky viewed Cohen as exotifying their community. It's by saying they're an other, they're different, they're strange in a way. Or is it the issue that none of them thought their daily lives were worth taping, and they didn't want some Yankee gaining recognition from taping them? Or both? Does it take someone from outside the community, or a cosmopolitan native, to be able to put those folk traditions into perspective in the broader picture of society, the world, to get them out there so that folks will know about it? That's a tough situation, kind of a paradox. Well, Farjian's discussion of the value and use of field recordings raises some interesting similar questions about value and control, and about power. What can we do to maximize the worth of what we're doing, not only to ourselves and our own projects, but to the people with whom we're working, and to people whose needs we can't even imagine right now, people who may use the recordings we make 100 years from now when they're in the archives of Appalachia or some other repository, or just on YouTube. And how can we make careful, well-documented recordings that are useful and well executed, not only in a technical way, but in an ethical way? Farjian seems to say having a plan for making and archiving them is an important part of the bargain, the ethical deal that we're making when you do field work. And she's saying we should also have plans to use them for the good of the community from which we take them. And I think there's some kind of sustainability, which is the theme of the journal from which her article comes, involved there. How can we make sure that we do that in our own work? That's one of the ways that one of the things I've been thinking about in creating this Soundpost assignment is to provide a way that we can do something that's useful for this community that we walk through and listen in, and that we also make noise in as well. So think about that, plan it, get it done, go Bucks, all the things.